Hey, so the Motorola Edge series has been its resurgence into flagship territory. And if you take a look at Motorola in the past, it's always been there and thereabouts when it comes to it competing with the likes of Samsung, Apple, LG back in the day as well, and more so now Huawei as well. And Motorola has always been in the shadows of these companies, but with the Motorola Edge sometime last year, I think this was before COVID or just during COVID, the Motorola Edge came out. And the Motorola Edge was a fantastic smartphone for the time because it had everything a flagship needed. It had a high refresh rate display. The display was fully curved off to the edges, I think 90 degrees in curvature on the edges. So that meant really immersive experiences when it came to multimedia. It had all of your hardware specifications, including the highest range chipset back in the day. And the camera layout with the battery on board wasn't too shabby either. I think the only sort of drawback for the smartphone was that it did not come with wireless charging support. But that aside, that was a fantastic smartphone, and the only two shortcomings for why it didn't do so well in the UAE were that number one, it was priced ridiculously high compared to its competition, and number two, its availability was much later than its international launch. So by the time it got to the UAE, the interest on the smartphone had died down completely and no one wanted to really buy the smartphone, and that's why it didn't really succeed. So a couple of months after that, maybe around 6 months or so, we got the Motorola Edge 20 Pro, and I happen to have this smartphone. I didn't have the previous one, but I do have this one. And the Motorola Edge 20 Pro was supposed to be the successor to the original Motorola Edge. However, when it came to specifications, it wasn't a successor. It was more of a different smartphone completely because all of the flagship smartphone specifications we saw with the Edge were stripped down with the Edge 20 Pro to make it presumably cheaper and more affordable to the general public. But that wasn't something that Motorola had to do, because if Motorola just stuck to its strategy of having high-end specifications, it could have had a very good smartphone on the Motorola Edge 20 Pro. This thing had a very good camera setup for its price tag, especially with that periscope telephoto lens, which allowed for 5x zoom, something that no other smartphone in this price bracket can do. But that aside, its flagship lineup sort of diluted, and I was there at the presentation when this smartphone was announced, and the number one question everyone had was, where is your flagship to this year's mid-range smartphone? And Motorola didn't have an answer to it because Motorola did not plan a flagship device. So it's been a couple of months since the launch of the Edge 20 Pro, and now we're hearing about the Motorola Edge 30 Ultra. And this is supposed to be the flagship smartphone for Motorola in the next coming year. And some of the specifications that we know so far about the smartphone include a 6.76-inch 144 Hz refresh rate display. So this smartphone had a 144 Hz refresh rate display, and the successor to it is supposed to have the same resolution and the same refresh rate, and so that way there is some sort of consistency with the Ultra. And bear in mind, this was the Pro, so I assume there's going to be a Motorola Edge 30 Pro with similar specifications to the Edge 20 Pro, and the Ultra is going to be their all-out flagship smartphone. Now, in terms of camera specifications, we're expecting a few changes. So this camera was a 108 megapixel camera, but it turns out the Ultra next year, whenever it comes out, the Edge 30 Ultra, is supposed to have a 50 megapixel OmniVision sensor alongside another 50 megapixel ultra wide angle sensor. So that doesn't particularly scream flagship to me, because if it was supposed to be a flagship smartphone, it would have employed a different sensor, not an OmniVision sensor, so that is something to bear in mind. And on paper, it does seem like a downgrade, the 108 megapixel camera on here and the 50 megapixel camera on its successor, although it all comes down to how the processor is optimized to run with the camera unit, and that's something we'll only find out once we see the smartphone in the wild. Another camera that is supposed to be on the Motorola Edge 30 Ultra is going to be the 2 megapixel macro camera. And again, that doesn't really scream flagship to me. So we're getting this mixed response of Motorola trying to cut costs in some regions and, try and have flagship specifications in others to make sure that the overall smartphone is budget friendly at the end of the day. We do have some renders of the smartphone. They're not particularly crisp or clear, but you do see a very uninspired design. I don't really think the design is too much to brag about from Motorola's side. So again, that could be somewhere that they are cost cutting. But in terms of the internal specifications, we are expecting to see the latest Qualcomm Snapdragon 898 processor on board. So that's supposed to come out next year, and hopefully Motorola employs that. And with its major selling point, which is the software that Motorola has, it's very clean and very up to date with Android 12, it is going to perform really well. I don't have any problem saying that right now. I think the Motorola software is one of the best softwares out there when it comes to the Android experience on any smartphone. So they've got that covered. I just wish they do more with the other hardware that we're speaking about. And so far it's looking like a mixed response. The processor is there, but the cameras, not so much. There's also a 5,000 milliamp hour battery rumored on the smartphone, and we hope to see some sort of wireless charging capabilities on the smartphone as well, because that would really complete the experience with fast charging, which is something that Motorola is already pushing with the smartphone. Now, in terms of the display, I did say it was a 144 Hz AMOLED, but we're not sure if the fingerprint scanner is going to be on the display or off to the side. This was an AMOLED panel as well, but the fingerprint scanner was off to the side, and it was really difficult to use. So I really wish that the Edge 30 Ultra has it on the display, because I think that's going to solve one of the disappointments of this smartphone. But yeah, that's pretty much everything you need to know about the Motorola Edge 30 Ultra. There's also a front-facing camera that we need to talk about, which is a 60 megapixel camera. So as I've said in the past, the megapixel count on any smartphone camera doesn't really give you the full story, because it comes down to how a company optimizes the experience for the camera to really, shine and really perform well. So even though it might be a 60 megapixel sensor, it might not even do as good as a 12 megapixel sensor. It all depends on how Motorola is pushing that hardware. The last thing that I want to talk about while we're on the hardware front is the IP rating of the smartphone. I said the IP68 certification was something that we should all expect from a flagship smartphone, but it looks like on the Edge 30 Ultra, we are getting an IP52 rating, which is something that is disappointing for a flagship smartphone. It's still going to be water resistant to some degree, but when you compare it to like dunking it in water or just being carefree around, water in the beach or something like that, you will have to be careful with that smartphone, because you're not going to get the full protection that you usually get on a flagship device. But yeah, I think that now sums up everything I wanted to say about the Edge 30 Ultra. It's shaping up to be a phone that is a flagship in some level or some respect, but isn't in others. And I don't know if Motorola is doing the right thing in making sure that it's flagship for the processor, it's flagship for the camera, but not so much when it comes to design or durability, because consumers these days, if they're paying a premium for a smartphone, they want premium experiences all around. And maybe that's something that Motorola needs to focus on. They still have time to fix this, because these are rumors, but that's just my opinion on that. I wish that Motorola isn't doing this just to make sure the cost of the smartphone is relevant, because we have seen flagship smartphones from other companies like Samsung or the iPhone even. Yes, they do have their companies backing and people do follow these companies loyally, but I think if Motorola just went all out and priced their smartphones competitively, just a little bit more competitively than they did the last year, they could be onto something. But we'll find out when the Edge 30 Ultra goes live in the next couple of months. Thank you guys for watching this video. Do let me know what you guys think down in the comments below, and make sure to like and subscribe for more videos. Thanks for watching. This was Vaibhav, and I'll see you in the next one. Adios.